Dr. Elizabeth Catte, tonight's speaker, is the author of Pure America, Eugenics and the Making of Modern Virginia. It is a sweeping history of eugenics in Virginia and by extension the United States. Between 1927 and 1979, more than 8,000 people were involuntarily sterilized in 5 hospitals across the Commonwealth. The state's 20th century eugenics program was not the misguided initiative of well-meaning men of the day, but rather a manifestation of white supremacy, a form of employment insurance, a means of controlling troublesome, in quotes, women, and a philosophy that helped remove poor people from valuable land. Dr. Catte is a historian living in Staunton, Virginia, and is also the author of What You Were Getting Wrong About Appalachia. She is the co-founder of Pacell Historical Consultants and an editor-at-large for West Virginia University Press. Her nonfiction writing and commentary has appeared in many outlets, including The Guardian, Foster Review, and McSweeney. So that everybody knows, at the end of her program this evening, Dr. Catte will be answering your questions. Please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's questions. So with that very long introduction, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Catte. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thanks to you all for tuning in tonight. I am so grateful to Carol Weinstein and the Weinstein family for sponsoring this lecture, and I'm so grateful also to the staff at the Library of Virginia, Director Scott Dodson, for inviting me to take part. I'm giving this talk tonight from my home in Stanton, which is a city that also serves as one of the primary locations in the book that I'll be introducing you to tonight. This is Pure America, Eugenics and the Making of Modern Virginia. It just came out earlier this month from Belt Publishing. Pure America is a book about eugenics, but also more specifically, it's about eugenics as it shaped Central Virginia. And when I say shaped, I do also mean that literally, not just figuratively. My book emphasizes not just what happened in the past, but also explores how Virginia's quest to achieve racial and genetic purity also left its mark on landscapes and spaces and communities, in addition to the bodies of its citizens. So I like to think that Pure America is about the houses that eugenics built, and sometimes they are literal houses. Just as a heads up tonight, I'm not going to show images because most of my sources, which came from the Library of Virginia, are text-based and they don't lend themselves well to sort of a PowerPoint style presentation. But if anybody wants to take advantage of the circumstances tonight that we're all joined together digitally, I would encourage you maybe to Google, for example, University of Virginia Eugenics exhibit, which was a digital exhibit built by the University of Virginia a couple of years ago that has a lot of interesting images about the eugenics movement in Virginia, but also nationwide. I am also imagining, maybe because the book is a little bit new, there will be people here who have joined just to hear more about the subject of eugenics generally, or perhaps want to know about people and events that were important to Virginia's eugenics history, like the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. So my intention tonight is to talk for about 45 minutes to keep it very general, and also spend some time towards the end talking about ways that history is visible or invisible today as well. But to really start, I thought that it might be good if we all got on the same page and talked a little bit about what eugenics is and also what eugenics isn't in the past, but also the present. So when we talk about eugenics, we're talking about a set of beliefs that began to circulate around the mid-19th century. And these beliefs suggested that human reproduction could be engineered for the benefit of society, a society which in this context, in this time, seemed to be growing ever more dysfunctional. So eugenics emerged as almost a kind of preventative medicine. It combined new ideas about genetics and heredity, and it suggested that if people in the present took urgent and collective action to think more deeply about these ideas, that future generations would be spared what they considered the pain that they were going through. That if healthy and able white people, for example, were encouraged to reproduce more, and the reproduction of so-called undesirable people restricted, that there might achieve a better balance in the future. And so in this era, when we say undesirable people, the people we were talking about specifically would include disabled people, non-white people, and particularly Black, Latino, and Native people, immigrants, poor people, and often just women. So eugenics can be positive or negative, can be active or passive. That is, and these are not moral descriptors. They just refer to the reality of what the scientific beliefs were. That is, sometimes the goal of eugenics is to add people to the population, so positive eugenics. And then sometimes the goal is to subtract people, remove people from the population, and that is negative eugenics. Eugenics can be overt and obvious, so compulsory sterilization would be a form of active eugenics. And sometimes the action is more cryptic and hidden, and that would be, for example, like rationing healthcare with the intent that depriving people of the ability to stay well, that there would be a dying off of people. So when we talk about eugenics, what we're not talking about generally is the decisions that people make regarding their own reproduction. Eugenics is very much a top-down set of beliefs, often intended to subvert the free will of the individual. So when people are making their own decisions about their health and their reproduction and whether or not to have children, they're often not doing that for the benefit of society. And so that's why we wouldn't describe those actions as negative eugenics generally. I write personally in Pure America most often about negative eugenics, that is, subtracting people from the population, controlling their reproduction. And negative eugenics came to be supported in laws in over 30 states, and eugenic sterilizations laws were on the books in Virginia until the 1970s. Nationwide, these laws resulted in the sterilization of over 60,000 people, and in Virginia, that number is 8,000. So now that we're a little bit more on the same page, I thought that I would also talk a little bit about why I decided to write a book like Pure America in the first place. In 2018, I released another book called What You Are Getting Wrong about Appalachia, and it's a book of criticism which, among other things, tried to discuss the origins of what we might call anti-rural stereotypes. So to give figures like the hillbilly or the yokel a place in history. And one of the things I wrote about were these myths I'm sure you've heard about, phantom groups of inbred white people kind of living isolated lives in the mountains. And I wrote about how those myths, how they made sense in a world where eugenics was overwhelmingly popular. These stereotypes imply that some rural people were living unnatural lives, that they were biologically ruined, that they were innately and irreversibly compromised. And these stereotypes also implied that for some rural people, they were just doomed to live difficult lives based on the circumstances of their birth, that the thing holding them back was simply who they were. So all of these stereotypes, you can imagine they're very handy for people who wanted to divert resources away from rural people. They were handy for people who wanted to make a play for the land that rural people were living on. They were also very handy for people who wanted to bring extractive industries into rural areas and use the people who were living there as a source of disposable labor. And today, I think we can still see the imprint of those ideas and beliefs that rural people are sometimes less intelligent than their peers, that they're clannish or hostile to ancestors, to outsiders, and sometimes there is, interest in using pseudo-ethnicities to explain what the primary qualities of rural people. So I'm from Appalachia, and we see a lot of discussion about Appalachian culture in terms of Scotch-Irish ancestry. And so there's been moments where that has taken on a focus in regard to explaining why the region is or isn't moving forward in the world. And one of the examples that I used to bring these ideas to life was a study of mountain people conducted in the early 1930s called Holofolk, which was specifically about families who were living in what is now the Shenandoah National Park. This study argued that these mountain people were devolving genetically, that they were biologically compromised, using kind of hallmark eugenic language, suggested that that process might be reversed to some degree if the mountaineers could be coaxed to separate from their families or lead less isolated life. So this argument meshed really well with ideas that park planners, for example, and social workers had about what should become of these families once the park is opened and would be depopulated for that purpose. So I think that by far and away, that was the sort of example and discussion of the book that people really wanted to hear more about, these connections between anti-rural stereotypes and eugenics. And so it was fortunate. There's good work on this topic already. There's Richard Knox Robinson's documentary. There's Katrina Powell's work specifically on the Shenandoah families. But I never quite got away after I published that book from discussing those ideas and those origins and these places that had to some degree been shaped by eugenic ideas. And I happened to write that book while I was living in Texas, and my partner Josh is from Virginia, and we decided to kind of do the move back home, but kind of further down the road, and that happened to be geographically kind of the Shenandoah Valley, Stanton area, and that's what we did. But it also meant that this site that I never quite got away from talking about was now in my own backyard. And so I was seeing it and passing it constantly, or at least the entrance to the park, as I went about my daily life. And so that kind of brought it even closer to me. But in Stanton, I also had a very interesting new neighbor, and that was the former campus of Western State Hospital, which the state of Virginia opened as a public psychiatric facility in 1828. And the hospital itself, the entity known as Western State, still operates out of Stanton and Augusta County in much more modern and updated facilities. But the site itself was abandoned for several years and then underwent renovation starting around 2006. And so today the site has a new life, is what the developers call upscale luxury housing. And there's also tourist amenities like a hotel and you know, conference facilities. So in this newer configuration, Western State had largely come back to life as, I would say, an architectural monument to the period from around 1840 to 1870, when physicians at the hospital were trying to embrace what is sometimes described by historians as the era of moral medicine. So this is a philosophy of patient care that disdained cruel and barbaric treatments of the past, so treating mental health patients as prisoners and keeping them confined all the time. So it disdained those older practices and tried to supplant those with more humane attitudes towards mental health patients, to see them as friends and brothers and members of the community and people who had the potential to be restored to society at some point in time. And so much like the Shenandoah Valley families, there were elements of this history that were known to me because I'm a historian and I do work in 20th century history. So I was familiar with the hospital's role in the eugenics movement, and I'll discuss that more fully in a bit. But I think it's true that probably most 20th century historians that do study eugenics study Virginia in some capacity because of the infamous Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell that originates here in 1924, 1927. So it's a history that is known to me, was known to me in kind of this very specific kind of classroom context. And so when I got here and when I lived here and when the site became my neighbor, and I saw it every day and passed it every day and had different vantage points at which I saw the site, kind of sometimes coming nose to nose with it while I waited in traffic, sometimes kind of looking out of it, looking down at it from the top of my neighborhood, which was a little bit elevated above the hospital itself, and seeing kind of the different types of arrangement of the space. It seemed odd to me that I could live in such close proximity to the site and still kind of have to reconcile on a daily basis how I saw the site as a 20th century historian who knew and had studied the history of eugenics, and then what the site was today, which was this architectural monument to a different time. And you know, I was constantly having to reconcile what I knew and also I think what the site wanted to be true. So for example, the site felt like it was telling me the humane treatment of patients and the arrangement of these beautiful buildings is the story here. It's what matters. This is what matters the most here in this place. And the past was kind of like, hold that thought. So these daily negotiations inspired me to write Pure America and center within that a history of eugenics that carries a sense of place. I wrote it as a local history. You know, I wanted to create a set of stories that would explain how my part of the world looks and functions the way that it does today, because I kind of feel that eugenics is one of those topics that is very, very well researched, but not at all well remembered by the public. And so in writing this kind of local history of eugenics with a sense of place, I also wanted to leave some room to discuss that reality, to take into account how that history appears or doesn't appear in everyday life, in ways sometimes that we might not even notice. And so I'll return to those points towards the end of our talk tonight, but let me not disadvantage anybody that has tuned in for just a broader outline of Virginia as it existed in the era of eugenics. And to do that, tonight am going to start at sort of the dawn of the 20th century in Virginia, as it was seen through the eyes of one of the most vocal leaders of the state's eugenic movement, a physician named Joseph DeJarnett. I'm gonna get a drink really fast. DeJarnett would become the longest serving director of Western State Hospital. He was there from about 1905 to 1943. And under DeJarnett, Western State grew in both patient capacity and physical size. So by the time that he assumes his directorship, the era of moral medicine is well and truly over. Western State has become a place that is arranged not towards care and cure, but generally just containment. And this is not a reality that is wholly induced by DeJarnett and his particular beliefs and philosophies about patient care. In fact, institutions nationwide were also experiencing similar transformations because the population of the United States was growing, lifespans were extending, the population was also growing through immigration, and more people sometimes equals more illness. There was age-related illness was on the rise, and at this time, conditions like dementia were seen through the lens of mental illness. Substance abuse was also on the rise, and again, substance abuse was seen primarily through the lens of mental illness. And beyond these kind of like specific treatment philosophies, it was also true that local communities started to gradually see these state hospitals as sites of convenience. They were far off places where people who were believed to be disorderly or antisocial could be sent away, and the state would manage their care. And this was not just an out of sight, out of mind arrangement. It was a deeply financial one as well. More and more disability, and illness came to be discussed in economic terms and through the costs associated with helping people survive. And so this meant that these ever-expanding groups of people came to be seen not only as unwell, but also very, very expensive. De Jarnett and his contemporaries believed that society had arrived at a breaking point, and that without intervention, these so-called undesirable people were going to outpopulate their betters. And in the process, they would place incalculable burdens on the financial health of the nation. A sociologist in 1901 named Edward A. Ross even had a dramatic label that he applied to this phenomenon, race suicide. And this was a problem thought to be of modern origins. And the root of the harm was not so much that there was suffering of vulnerable people, and the suffering of vulnerable people seemed to be increasing, but it was the idea that this world would become so inhospitable, that sharing a world with these vulnerable people would be so uninviting, that these so-called better people would begin eliminating themselves. These good family, people from good families would begin eliminating themselves by restricting their own reproduction. And so eugenics began to gain in popularity as a set of beliefs that could explain the problem, so explain how and why society had arrived at this breaking point, but it could also provide a collective solution. Wealthy philanthropists started funneling money towards the study of eugenics. So the Rockefellers, Carnegies, the Kellogg's, the Harrimans started to fund and establish laboratories that would serve as kind of like a nerve center for the study of eugenics. And even beyond that, though, eugenics started to diffuse out of the academy and out of the laboratory and into everyday life. It took on the characteristics of a social movement. Lawmakers and state leaders and politicians sought the advice of eugenicists in devising new laws and policies and to address a range of social problems. And Americans began really embracing eugenics as a kind of participatory science that anyone who was rational or intelligent or future-minded would want to take part in. And they would fill out genetic questionnaires, they would research their ancestry, they would create competitions out of measuring their children according to newly devised child development standards. And much like all other Americans, Virginians also embraced eugenics to a really astonishing degree. In many ways, eugenics helped Virginians set the stage for a new vision for the state in the 20th century, and sort of provided a blueprint for how state leaders could distinguish themselves and distinguish the state. So for example, debates about whether or not Southern states would shed their backward ways were pretty plentiful at this time. And eugenics helped Virginians answer that question and address those debates with a resounding yes, that yes, we are prepared to kind of shed this backwardsness, this backwards facing attitudes. We're ready to embrace the future. We're going to put things that are very rational, very clinical, very scientific at the forefront of our plans to modernize the state. And probably the best example of this is sort of the changes in development of the University of Virginia at this time. And on that subject, historian Gregory Dorr's book, Segregation Science, is really excellent and thorough. But eugenics offered a kind of duality to Southern states like Virginia. Eugenics allowed Virginia to appear progressive and future-facing and science-minded, while at the same time, it offered ways to protect the existing hierarchy by claiming as a scientific truth the inferiority of groups and individuals that had just been just as condemned in previous generations. In 1910, for example, Virginia established the Lynchburg Colony, which was a facility designed for the containment of a newly invented group in the era of eugenics, which were the feeble-minded. Feeble-minded people were believed to be hereditarily deficient in mental capacity. So these were people who were poor, generally just poor, not easily labeled according to existing categories of disability, but who had been found by society to be similarly unproductive. They could be people who were thought to possess lower intelligence, and sort of the invention of intelligence testing goes hand in the rise of intelligence testing as a diagnostic tool goes hand in hand with the development of these institutions and development of the categories like feeble-minded. So thought to possess lower intelligence. They could also be believed to have flaws in their morals or characters. And women were especially vulnerable to labels of this type. Women who were thought to be promiscuous, who became single mothers, women who were truant or runaways. Again, this is a very intentionally broad group designed to be a dragnet for many, many different types of people. And so the state contained many, but not all, the people who were committed as feeble-minded at the Lynchburg Colony, which was by design part workhouse and part asylum. The director of the colony was a physician named Albert Priddy, and he had suffered some minor legal consequences around 1918 for sterilizing women outside of the law. Eugenic sterilization was a preferred method of negative eugenics to restrict reproduction, but it was not yet legal in Virginia. It was legal in states like Indiana, and Virginia wanted to move in that direction, but it had not achieved the legalization of those that method of control yet. And so people like Albert Priddy sometimes operated literally outside of the law, and those records kind of reflect these coincidental numbers of women committed as feeble-minded, but who needed surgeries to address unspecified reproductive problems. And so it was these kinds of controversies that really helped set the stage for physicians in Virginia and lawmakers to really commit to bringing about a law that explicitly permitted legalized sterilization. And so with the help of leaders who were working in the national movement, these national nerve centers founded by tycoon families, they studied the successes and failures of these laws nationwide, and where they had passed and where they had failed, and why those outcomes had occurred. And so with the assistance from the national movement, Virginia did achieve the passage of a eugenic sterilization law in 1924 without much controversy. And yet I think that the sting of possibly those older controversies and minor legal challenges made state lawmakers want to be a little bit more conservative. So even though they had the law, they wanted to move slowly and test the appeals process first. So the law permitted the compulsory sterilization of individuals committed at state hospitals who were, quote, afflicted with hereditary forms of insanity that are recurrent, idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, or epilepsy. And so that gave the state pretty wide discretion to apply the sterilization law. But before doing so, it wanted to select a patient who had been committed to a state facility, and then instruct that patient and move on that patient's behalf to execute an appeals process to strengthen the law by the patient effectively having an appeal fail. And the patient selected by Albert Priddy was a young woman from Charlottesville named Carrie Buck. Carrie had been removed from the care of her mother, who was also later committed to the Lynchburg Colony. Carrie had been removed from Emma's care as a young child and placed as a foster child with a local family called the Dobbses. And so once Carrie is around 10 or 11 years old, she's removed from school by the Dobbses and essentially becomes their housekeeper, their live-in help. And this arrangement persists until Carrie is around 17 years old, and she is raped by the nephew of her foster mother. Carrie becomes pregnant, and hoping to avoid further scandal, the Dobbses sought Carrie's commitment to the Lynchburg Colony in 1924. Carrie first gives birth to a daughter named Vivian, and then she is placed with the colony just months after the sterilization law is enacted. And from the perspective of the law, and from the perspective of the physicians working at the colony and in conjunction with the other state superintendents as well, Carrie is selected as kind of the perfect test case. She has been committed as feeble-minded. Her mother has been committed as feeble-minded, and there were nurses in the community willing to testify that her barely months-old daughter was also feeble-minded. So Carrie's life becomes a matter of law after the Supreme Court upheld the right of Virginia to sterilize her in 1927. That Supreme Court case is known as Buck v. Bell, and is still law of the land today. So as local experts, Albert Priddy, director of the colony, and Joseph DeJarnett, director of Western State Hospital, provided expert witness testimony, as well as these sort of nationally famous experts from the eugenics movement and the Eugenics Record Office, which is an organization based in New York. And just as an aside, the case is known as Buck v. Bell, not Buck v. Priddy, because Albert Priddy died during this appeals process, and the case was named after his successor, John Bell. And so the testimony provided by these national leaders is really damning. There were pronouncements that Carrie and her mother were members of the, quote, shiftless, ignorant, worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. But it's the testimony of Priddy and of DeJarnett that I think is most revealing towards kind of understanding the vision for society that eugenicists in Virginia held and what they thought that the benefits of sterilization could truly be. So DeJarnett testified that, quote, it benefits society by not taking care of them, meaning sterilized patients, and the work that they do. They are the hewers of wood and drawers of water. So if you know the Bible, you might know that the book of Joshua, in the book of Joshua, the phrase hewers of wood and drawers of water is used to describe people who are performing the lowest forms of menial labor. So if eugenics was intended to solve problems involving both biology and economics, this kind of gives us an indication of how eugenicists plan to also manage the economic side. And so what DeJarnett explained with this kind of bizarre biblical flourish, Albert Priddy explained to the courts in plainer English. He said, the demand for domestics and housework is so great that we could get rid of half of our women of average intelligence, but I have had to abolish it. They go out, and it is so common for them to come back pregnant that I've had to quit taking the risk. Nobody wants to take them when there is a constant chance of them becoming mothers. So in other words, sterilization would make poor women better housekeepers. Pregnancy couldn't interrupt their productivity, and it could avoid potentially bringing scandal onto a family. And so Carrie is sterilized in 1927, and afterwards she is indeed leased out thereafter by the colony as a domestic worker to two families, and that arrangement persisted until Carrie married in 1932. Virginia also passed, at the same time that it passed its eugenic sterilization law, an incredibly restrictive Racial Integrity Act. And this law was intended to aid in segregation, to outlaw interracial marriage, and to affix a standard of racial purity for white people using a one-drop rule. Now, one-drop rules are sort of like semi-legal principles common in the South that say at this time that say anyone with any kind of trace of non-white ancestry is non-white, should be considered non-white for purposes of the law. And so while legal compulsory segregation had introduced new methods to control people like Carrie Buck, these so-called worthless white people, Virginia was also enacting measures to explicitly deepen their control, further their control over the lives of Black people and Native peoples as well. And these were also informed by what state leaders claimed were eugenic truths. For example, John Powell, who's kind of credited as being the architect of this law, explained that one drop of Negro blood makes the Negro is no longer a theory based on race pride or color prejudice, but a logically induced scientific fact. And so you can see how like these older customs, older outlooks of the South are kind of getting re-strengthened through so-called eugenic truths. One immediate outcome of this law is that the State Bureau of Vital Statistics in Richmond, under its director, Walter Plecker, recognized citizens only as white or colored after 1924. This meant that all Native peoples in Virginia were racially recomposed, bureaucratically speaking, on paper as colored. And some white people were also racially recomposed in a similar way. This was a situation, a reality where the pet theories of Walter Plecker and his fellow registrars could really be enacted to devastating effect among the lives of the Commonwealth citizens. He boasted once, Walter Plecker did, that Hitler's genealogical study of Jewish people was not more complete than his own study of Virginia citizens. And so he distributed his research, what he claimed to be research, widely among state registrars' offices. He had, for example, hit lists of Virginia families that he felt would be would attempt white passing, for example. He distributed that to registrars and instructed them to use that information to deny marriage licenses to people, to prevent these families from enrolling in white schools, to prevent them from trying to bury people in white cemeteries. And sometimes he sent contact out as sort of an advanced warning that he intended to instigate legal proceedings against these people for misrepresentation of race. Plecker used a eugenic myth about Native peoples to justify his actions, and that myth was that all modern Native peoples were mixed race. So he was really gleeful, for example, and very excited to learn that, again, these nationally famous researchers from the Eugenics Record Office were going to come into Amherst and Rockbridge County, sort of down towards Lexington, and complete a study on people who in reality were Monacan Indians, but who researchers completing this field work were describing as mongrels. Eugenicists believed that Native peoples were not only biracial but triracial, that they were the sort of a composite of the worst traits to be found in white people and Native people and in Black people. And so Plecker altered the vital records of Native people in Virginia based on these myths, racially recomposing them on paper to an extent so great that 6 Virginia tribes were unable to complete the process for federal recognition until 2018, and only then by the intervention of a special act of legislation. In 2015, the state of Virginia became the second state after North Carolina to offer financial compensation to survivors of eugenic sterilization. The General Assembly approved a sum of $25,000 for people who could demonstrate that they had been sterilized at one of the 5 Virginia state hospitals. So that would be Southwestern State, Eastern State, Western State, Central State, and the former Lynchburg Colony. North Carolina had offered 50,000. In Virginia, the peak of sterilizations occur in the 1930s and 1940s. And so the last time that I requested a figure from the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health about how many people had been able to use this program, that number, and that was last year in 2020, by the way, that number was 28 people. So, and in fact, the state had kind of done some like actuarial math in the background and figured that the number of people who might be both still living and willing to identify themselves as a survivor of eugenic sterilization was more along the lines of like 16 to 20. So on one hand, perhaps it is good that more people than anticipated were able to utilize that program more than the state had originally planned. On the other hand, we can say that we now know that more than 50 years of eugenics in Virginia cost around $70,000, and that seems insufficient. And again, state relief is only extended toward this one method among many, which was again eugenic sterilization. In writing a book like this, I am often asked, how can we resist contemporary eugenics? So how can we confront the legacy of eugenics in a way that sort of like makes things better in the present? So tonight, also just to switch gears in this talk a little bit, I wanted to answer that question in 2 ways. And the first is just to sort of mention some laws and policies and systems that currently exist that still reflect, in my opinion, the logic of eugenics. And so this will not be an exhaustive list by any means, but I do want to give you an idea of where I see this past continuing to circulate in the present. And beyond that, though, I also wanted to address that question as a historian and to kind of talk about it as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about what kind of histories get remembered and forgotten, acknowledged, or what histories remain invisible today. So in the past, I think, it's fair to say that eugenics gained power because it had the potential to make resentment seem rational. And I think that's why it's important today when we think about eugenics. We think about it not just as a set of beliefs about racial and economic purity, which it certainly was, but it also contained ideas about economic purity as well. And there's much more about this in my book. But this resentment became easily expressed in economic terms. It was a science that was about wiping the slate clean of debts inflicted by so-called unfit people. For example, one eugenics society in the 1920s sent out mailers that claimed for every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes to the care of persons with bad heredity, the insane, the feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. And just 2 days ago, I was stuck in traffic behind a truck that had a bumper sticker that expressed a very similar idea, and it said, if you can't feed them, don't breed them. And so I think that we have a duty to be skeptical towards arguments that imply that we should ration critical or life-saving assistance for economic reasons. We should be skeptical of arguments that center rationing. And so obviously I think that the chief arena where this happens a lot today, and we can see it happening in real time, is sort of our healthcare system. And we have a market-based system of healthcare that means wellness is often contingent on our ability pay for it, and we have a system that forces people who cannot or won't work to accept an inferior product. And so I tend to think that the eugenic implications of the way our healthcare system is currently arranged are pretty vast. And the only way to really mitigate that is to make sure that vulnerable people have equal access. I think that because of the pandemic, we could spend quite a lot of time tonight talking about healthcare disparities and the ways that these disparities have limited our capacity to fight and control the virus. But just for now, let me acknowledge that in writing this book, I felt released from the chore of trying to work really hard to invite people into sort of a remote and distant world, to draw people into a world where ideas about who should live and who should die and who is too expensive to save were part of everyday life. Also, I want to say that today, incarcerated people are particularly vulnerable to forced sterilization. For example, the state of California was found to have sterilized 1,400 incarcerated people between 1997 and 2013. And this is just likely the surface of it, because the auditors and investigative reporters who were looking for evidence of this established their patterns by looking at records related to the sterilization of pregnant people. And so there would be a very obvious medical record of those procedures, because women would become incarcerated while pregnant, and then during the delivery aftercare process would be sterilized. And so many of these victims are also Black women and Latina women. And also, in some cases, judges will sometimes use permanent birth control as a bargaining chip. And we had a case like that in Virginia in 2014 or 2015, where a judge was found to be, or perhaps it was a district attorney, but to shave 5 years off of a criminal sentence for hit and run to a man who agreed to undergo a vasectomy, for example. We also have a number of laws and policies at the federal level that have sort of goals and outcomes that are reminiscent of eugenic goals. For example, eligibility for Social Security and for Medicaid weigh a spouse's income and assets. And this means that disabled people sometimes are hesitant to marry, and say that this arrangement recalls a version of eugenic marriage restrictions that existed in the past. It is also currently legal at the federal level to pay disabled workers a sub-minimum wage, and this arrangement is common to what are sometimes called sheltered workshops, so work sites that exist specifically to facilitate the employment of disabled people, where work often takes the form of bench work or piecework, for example. And these sheltered workshops and sort of the outlook about labor and disabled people is very complicated, and there's more in the book about this, but there's some historical connections there to that kind of work in institutions like the Lynchburg Colony in Western State, where committed patients were expected to take up on-site employment to offset the cost of their care and confinement. And that sort of brings me, that's a good segue into the second part of this, which is how do you talk about eugenics and the history of eugenics as a living thing, to see the imprint of the past on the present, just even beyond the laws and policies and ways that those ideas circulate today. One thing that I think was really odd about living in my community is that I don't know if I hadn't been a historian, I think that I would have had a really difficult time trying to place the history of eugenics in Stanton and the wider Shenandoah Valley, and that is kind of odd and in some ways troubling because Western State was the second highest sterilizing facility in Virginia. There are no markers, there's no memorials, there's no there's one book in the library about eugenics broadly. We have a really great historical society that has some interesting documents, but to understand them, I think you need to read them in conjunction with administrative paperwork that's held several hours away at Richmond at the Library of Virginia. And even though the site is still operational in some capacity, it only claims, as part of its branding, a very narrow slice of this past. And so I kind of get it. I do. Eugenics is really painful. It has a tendency to stray into morbid stories. It's not inviting at all. There's no consolation to this history. There's no arc of progress that eugenics bends towards. Some people like me who know about this past might be, possibly more alert to the idea that, there could be a resurgence of eugenic ideas in the present, but it just doesn't feel in some ways like a living past. It's a past that, when you start thinking about it, is full of absences. It's full of ideas and people and futures that will never exist. And so how do you make that past feel alive? So that is why I think that the state hospital environment and state hospitals are such important places to anchor the history of eugenics, and why the history of eugenics sort of shouldn't be excluded from these places. For example, the modern entity of Western State, for example, has a short historical timeline on their website that does not mention the history of eugenics at all, although it does praise itself, again, similar to the arrangement of the sort of like the reconfigured, redeveloped Western State, praises itself for this era of moral medicine and its, quote, efforts to understand and treat mental health clients in humane treatment facilities. So that history is foregrounded, but not the history of eugenics. And so I thought a lot about how to kind of reconcile this dilemma, because I do sense those reactions to things like morbid history, sterilization, and I thought that state hospitals might also be able to kind of address this dilemma, because state hospitals weren't just places where operations were performed, they were also environments that reflected the ways that these related goals of eugenics, so racial purity, genetic purity, but also economic purity, came to be enmeshed. So for example, observing his patients in 1921, to bring it back to Joseph DeJarnett, he noted, in my opinion, the most practical methods for handling the unfit is sterilization. According to Mendels Law, a large number of this class are as much manufactured articles as plows and harrows. But plows and harrows are strong tools, and that's how Virginia treated them and how it expected them to repay the price of being born. At Western State, for example, under DeJarnett's supervision, laboring patients did agricultural work, they did domestic work, they worked on the hospital's large farms, they produced food for patients and domestic animals, they generated a surplus that was sometimes used to generate profits. Their industrial efficiency helped DeJarnett justify and pay for further increases to the hospital's land holdings. Patients performed the core domestic functions. They cooked, they cleaned. Their diligent efforts took care of all that important architecture that my community finds so valuable today. They even sewed burial shrouds and helped inter deceased patients in hospital and then known as graves behind the hospital. And by DeJarnett's own admission, the hospital could not function without the labor of the patients that worked there. Patients who were sometimes committed for life and sometimes were only spending time there temporarily. Patients also built buildings at Western State, 7 by my count, including, yes, finally, the houses. physicians' houses, but also patient dormitories that are occupied today by new owners in their sort of redeveloped form. So Jarnett believed that his regular force at Western State, as he called them, were especially good and skilled in this capacity in the building trades. He praised their splendid cooperation in the construction of architectural features that allowed the buildings that he commissioned and designed and built to blend in with that older, finer pre-Civil War architecture. He boasted that he could enhance the physical world of Western State in such a way because, with the exception of some masonry work, patients handled most of the hospital's construction needs and their labor did not require compensation. So in Pure America, I write a little bit more about this. I say that de Jarnett's idea of economic purity looked like a balance sheet wiped clean of the debts people like Carrie Buck inflicted on society. He fixated on controlling their numbers, perpetually calibrating the rate of return on his actions. 1/2 of the population will be insane by the year 2000, he tabulates in one set of notes, but with sterilization, none of us might be. He was meticulous in figures from his own life, to recording the number of apples he might purchase on a journey or the cost of his daily newspapers. Each day, there were new numbers. Each day, a chance for balance and order. Each day to the hospital where the numbers lived. Each year, ever more of them arriving. However, order remained elusive. The pleasure of an ultimate tabulation always deferred to someone else, a member of a future generation who would arrive in the world and hopefully find the slate wiped clean. Through his frenzied math, he convinces himself all would be well eventually. And yet where could he find his own satisfaction? By helping expanding society's definitions of the unfit, by arguing their ever-growing and costly numbers. He was now awash in debts incurred by their confinement and care. What ledger book could ever balance such a paradox? Western State could. And so perhaps I think that if we shifted our understanding of eugenics away from the world that eugenicists like de Jarnett were trying to create, and instead also tried as hard to see the world they actually did create, that might help address this dilemma, to kind of think about the world that they actually succeeded in making, to kind of reverse the perception of eugenics as a failed science, to more of a to also a world building enterprise. And so the world of the state hospital, I think, achieves that. And so there's a similar discussion there also of the logic of eugenics and how it helped in the creation of, for example, the Shenandoah National Park, and how eugenic ideas also left their mark on Charlottesville as well. All these places that I simply chose to examine because they're part of my everyday life. I wanted to conclude this portion just by sharing that the Central Virginia Training Center closed in 2020. And so perhaps, like Stanton, that community will also be thinking about questions about what to do with the site afterwards. And I think that some people might think that I would say, oh, it has to be a museum, and that's not the case at all. Sometimes different kinds of development are what makes sense. But I would also just like to quickly say that there are human remains at all of these sites. In Stanton and in Lynchburg, there are large cemeteries associated with these hospitals. And so I think it would be wonderful if the state would take further steps to ensure their protection. It might be too late for our cemetery in Stanton, but it isn't for these other institutions. So thank you much for your attention and engagement as I work through these ideas. For the rest of the time that we have tonight, I'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting program. I think the part that really struck me about the book, aside from just the horrors that were going on, is just kind of how you related that to your personal experience. And at the end of the book, when you talk about spending the night in the hotel and like trying to process everything that the hospital was with what it is now. I found that really interesting. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to read the book, there's some really interesting pieces like that throughout, that I think really, in some ways, set it apart from some other historical books that I've read. So,
Thank you.
Say that. The first set of questions is from Allison Mead, and it was eugenics commonly practiced in Virginia before the program was formalized in 1927? If so, what was the time frame and in what part of Virginia?
So I think I alluded to the answer that I'll give earlier when I discussed the kind of like the legal troubles of Albert Priddy and his kind of operating on women outside the law. So Virginia is a state where eugenic sterilization was practiced before it was legal, and so it was practiced at places like the colony. And that would be about like 1912, 1910 to 1924 when the law came into effect. And so you can see that. And Paul Lombardo, who is a legal historian, has some great discussion of this in some of his books. But the coincidental patterns of women who come to the colony admitted as feeble-minded patients and then have coincidental operations to treat reproductive illnesses. Virginia also conducted castration experiments on incarcerated men around 1910, and the Library of Virginia actually has some blog posts about that people can look up, including some photographic documentation, not of the surgeries, but of who these people were. There's a prison surgeon named Charles Carrington who operated out of Richmond, who took inspiration, I think, from Indiana and the developments of the vasectomy technique and applied those to prisoners, and his sample was disproportionately Black men who were incarcerated. So there's two kind of areas where illegal operations took place in Virginia from about the turn of the century until the law legalized sterilization in 1924, 1927.
This question is from Chris Barnhart. While the book focuses on the history of Western states, is the story significantly different at the other institutions around the state, like Central State and Petersburg?
The sterilization story is not fundamentally different. Virginia is a state that doesn't seem to have disproportionately applied sterilization to minority women, like some states like North Carolina and like California. So that would be Black women for North Carolina and Latino women for California. So that didn't happen in Virginia. And if we pull back from sterilization statistics, the number of people being sterilized generally makes sense with the population. So 20%, for example, of people sterilized were Black in Virginia. And if you pull back and look at the state's population, that kind of makes sense. But there are other ideas about mental illness in Black people that kind of are part of the history of places like Central State. For example, can give you like a preview that, before emancipation, Black people were thought to be immune from mental illness. So there was that persistent belief. And then after emancipation, Black people are thought to become incredibly vulnerable to mental illness. So there is a higher coincidence in Virginia of Black people, for example, having significant mental health disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And researchers are looking further into the history of places like Central State to try to get more information about that. Central State, which is the first institution for Black mental health patients in the country, just celebrated its 150th anniversary. And so they had, I don't know how COVID affected the really nice array of programs that they had planned, but there's a lot of people who are doing some great work on Central State specifically in the history of Black mental health patients in Virginia that should be making its way into the world quite soon.
Okay. I'm going to ask these two questions. One is from Victoria Mann and one is from Kate Harsley, because they're similar. The first is, how can I find out what happened to a relative who died in Western State in 1913? In parentheses, I've seen the death certificate and I don't necessarily believe the cause of death, or the stated cause of death. And the second was, how can the records from that time be accessed to search for family names?
I might have to enlist you, Scott, in helping me answer some of these questions about state records. But generally speaking, the records that are available to me as a researcher will be different than the records that are available to family members. The right to medical privacy exists after death. And so in terms of records that identify, like a singular medical record that identify patients by name, those are always going to be restricted in Virginia. Those aren't in the Library of Virginia, for example. And so to find out information about a relative, presuming that you have the legal right to access that information as sort of like a next of kin or next surviving relative, then you would likely have to go through the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health. What is available to researchers, for example, that come to a place like the Library of Virginia? Records are expertly arranged and organized. They are overwhelming in terms of the number of documents that are available, but they are there and tell tremendous stories about these sites. But they are protected in terms of identifying information that people can find by name, identifiable information. So those are there and they're worth looking at, but anything that identifies a patient specifically needs to go through the process for medical records.
And I'll just add to that in the same way I add to anybody that asks me an informational question about the library. We have an amazing staff here. I think if you reach out to anyone here through our informational channels or in the library itself, someone will probably be able to help you at least get in the right direction and point you in the right direction to answer these questions. We were kind of running out of time, and I just wanted to thank you again for meeting with us today or doing this program. I hope that everybody on the program today really enjoyed it. If you are interested in any of the remainder of our Weinstein Author Series programs for the year, as I said earlier, April 15th, we have Kim Roberts by Broad Potomac Shore. On June 10th, we have Dr. Vanessa Holden and her book, Surviving Southampton, African American Women in Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. And then we move into September, where we hope to have in-person events again. And, you know, like everything, we kind of play it by ear, but we hope to be able to see people in person this fall. And on September 14th, we're bringing in Karen Cox with her new book, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. And then on November 17th, we're bringing in New York Times best-selling author Alexis Coe in her book, You'll Never Forget Your First, the biography of George Washington. You can always search the events area of the library's website. Thank you again. Everybody have a fantastic evening.